The world without alarm clock. Well now, young'uns, gather round. Let me tell you something curious about them olden days. You see, in the 1600s, folks didn't have no shiny phones, no buzzing alarms, not even the tick-tocking kind of clocks most of us take for granted today. Nah, in them times, a man's life was hitched straight to the sun, the rooster, and the good Lord's bells. Daily life in the 1600s. Picture it with me, if you will, colonial America, the 17th century. Dirt roads where wagons groaned, smoke rising from chimneys at dawn, and the whole world still half asleep. There wa'n't no electricity to jolt you awake, no factory whistles screaming across a cityscape, just the stillness of night, broken by the rustle of trees or the occasional call of a watchman. And yet, people had to rise. Farmers had fields to plow. Children had chores waiting. Soldiers needed drilling, and church bells called out to every soul that claimed righteousness. Time mattered, even if they didn't have a device buzzing in their pocket, reminding them of it. The importance of time. Now, don't think for a minute that time was less sacred back then. If anything, it was sharper, heavier. Missing the morning light could mean losing your day's harvest. Miss the church bell, and you might be called lazy in the eyes of your neighbors, or worse, sinful in the eyes of God. You see, being on time weren't about appointments. It was about survival, reputation, and providence. Natural alarms, sunrise, roosters, nature. So how'd they do it, you ask? Well, nature herself was the grand alarm clock. The rooster crowing his mighty cock-a-doodle-doo at the crack of dawn, the sunlight spilling through the cracks of a wooden shutter, even the chill of night slipping away round 4 o'clock could stir a body from slumber. Folks had ears tuned sharper than ours today. When you live close to the land, you don't need a gadget telling you it's morning. You feel it. The rooster, the sun, the rhythm of the natural world. It woke every man, woman, and child. Community signals, bells, watchmen, town criers. Course, it weren't just nature. Communities had their ways too. The church bell tolled out across villages, calling not just to prayer, but often marking the very passage of hours. Some places had town criers, shouting the day's news at dawn. Others had watchmen walking the streets by lantern light, calling the hours through the night. 2 o'clock and all's well, which in turn reminded folks how long till morning. These sounds carried across wooden walls and cobbled streets, working just like a chorus of alarms. Only they came from human lungs and iron bells, not machines. The body's internal clock, segmented sleep. Now here's a thing most don't know. People didn't sleep the way we do today. Nah, sir. Back then, many folks practiced what they called first sleep and second sleep. They'd lay down not long after sundown, sleep a good 4 or 5 hours, then stir awake in the dead of night. Some used them quiet hours for prayer, reading the good book by candlelight, or even visiting neighbors. Then, after a spell, they'd tuck back in till dawn. This rhythm, this natural dance of sleep and wakefulness, meant the body was often already half awake when the rooster crowed or the church bell chimed. You didn't need no snooze button. Your very bones knew when it was time to rise. Now, look at us today. We got phones beeping, buzzing, singing tunes to yank us out of dreamland. And yet, ain't it funny? We still fight it. We still groan, roll over, slap the button, beg for 5 more minutes. Back then, folks didn't have the choice. The sun rose, the rooster crowed, the bell rang, and you got up. There weren't no ignoring the world. The land demanded it. The community expected it. The soul believed it. So, my dear listener, in the 1600s, The alarm clock was all round you, the crow of a bird, the toll of a bell, the whisper of God's own sunrise, and in a way, maybe it was gentler, maybe it was harsher. But I tell you true, it sure was simpler. And that's how the world woke in them colonial days, without gadgets, without buzzers, but with a harmony between nature, community, and the human spirit. In the next part, we'll wander deeper into the little tricks and clever methods folks use to rouse themselves, some of which may surprise you. Colonial wake-up methods. Now then, we've seen how the world moved without alarms, but you might be wondering, Grandpa, how exactly did folks drag themselves out of bed day after day? Well, let me tell you, our ancestors were clever critters. They made do with what they had, and every sunrise brought its own call to duty, roosters and animals. First off, you can't talk about waking without mentioning the rooster. That bird was the loudest alarm clock God ever put feathers on. At the crack of dawn, that old fella would puff up his chest, flap his wings, and bellow out a cock-a-doodle-doo that could wake the dead. Chickens, cows lowing, dogs stirring, they all joined in a sort of barnyard chorus. If you lived near livestock, there was no ignoring it. The rooster was faithful, free, and louder than any bell tower. Folks depended on him, and he never hit snooze, sunlight, and architecture. But if you didn't got no rooster, well, the sun herself was enough. Colonists built homes with small shuttered windows, and when them shutters cracked open at dawn, the light cut straight across the room like a blade of fire. Imagine laying there on a straw mattress, wool blanket pulled tight, and then, bam, the sun spills across your eyes, dust dancing in the beam. There wa'n't no resisting it. The houses themselves seemed to conspire with the sunrise to shake folks awake. Some even positioned windows so the light hit square on their faces come morning. Practical folk, them colonists, were church bells and community rhythms. Course, not all alarms were private. In towns, the church bell ruled the rhythm of life. That iron tongue would toll at dawn, ringing across fields and streets alike. It called folks to prayer, to work, to gatherings. If you heard the bell and didn't stir, well, every neighbor knew you slept in. The bell was as much about accountability as it was about time. It was the sound of the community waking together, tied to the same rhythm. Town watchmen / night guards, and through the night, there were the watchmen, men patrolling the dark streets, lantern in one hand, staff in the other, calling the hours as they passed. 1 o'clock and all's well, they'd shout. Then again at 2, then 3. Now, them voices carry. Even if you were indoors, you heard 'em. And by the time they called out the last hours before dawn, some folks were already stirring, knowing it was near time to rise. The watchmen weren't just protectors, they were human timekeepers. Knocker-uppers. Now, here's a curious little trick, mostly from back in England, but some colonists brought the habit. They called them knocker-uppers. Men or women hired to wake workers by tapping on their windows with long sticks, sometimes even shooting dried peas at the glass. A funny thought, ain't it? Paying someone to come rap at your window every morning. But for mill workers and tradesfolk, it was worth every penny. In the colonies, especially the busier towns, I reckon more than one master borrowed the idea, sending his servant to play knocker-upper for apprentices. Household routines, family as alarm system. But the most faithful alarm of all, family. Mama shaking the children awake, Papa calling the boys to tend the animals, older sisters dragging sleepyheads out of straw beds. Households were tight ships. Everybody had chores, and waking each other was part of the duty. Sometimes The youngest got the job of waking the elders. It toughened them, taught responsibility early on. There weren't no lazy mornings. The house was alive with clatter. Before the sun fully cleared the horizon, rare mechanical alarm clocks, a luxury for the wealthy. Now, I won't lie to you. A few fancy folk had something special. Mechanical alarm clocks, shipped over from Europe, beautiful brass things with gears and springs, and a little bell that rang sharp when the hour struck. But let me tell you, they were rarer than hen's teeth. Only merchants, governors, or the real high folk could afford one. And if you ever saw one, it was like staring at magic. A machine that could wake you without sun or rooster. That was the future whispering through brass and steel comparison between rich and poor. So there you had it, the split plain as day. The poor man woke to the rooster, the sun, the bell. The rich man, maybe, to a glittering brass contraption. But I'll tell you this, both rich and poor had to rise just the same. The fields didn't wait, the church didn't wait, the sun didn't wait. Whether you had feathers, bells, servants, or springs, every soul in them colonies still faced the same truth. When the day came calling, you best be ready. And so, my dear listener, that's how colonists roused themselves from slumber. Roosters, sunlight, bells, watchmen, family hands, even the rare bit of clockwork. It was a world stitched together by sounds and light, by duty and necessity. Now, as we wander on to the final part, we'll see how all these ways of waking shaped more than just mornings. They shaped a culture, a faith, and a legacy we still wrestle with today. Timekeeping legacy and the human alarm. Now, you see, after we've talked on how folks woke without alarms and the tricks they used, it's time we turn to the bigger picture, the legacy of waking up in them times. 'Cause it weren't just about getting out of bed, no sir. It was about who you were, what you believed, and how you stood in the eyes of your neighbors and in the eyes of God. The rise of personal responsibility. In them days, being on time weren't just a handy habit. It was a matter of honor. You didn't got no boss sending you calendar invites or no factory whistle screeching. It was you and your willpower. If you failed to rise, your farm paid the price. If you failed to show it muster, the militia marked you unreliable. So waking on time became a sign of discipline, even virtue. People said the early bird catches the worm, but back then it was more like the early man keeps his family fed and his soul respected. Religion and work ethic. Now don't forget, many of them colonists were Puritans, hard as hickory when it came to duty. They saw sloth as sinful, a mark of the devil hisself. Sleeping in too long weren't just lazy, it was shameful. They preached that a godly man rose early, met the dawn with prayer, and set his hands to labor without complaint. So every morning, wake up carried with it a whisper of heaven and hell. You didn't just miss the rooster, you risked your soul's reputation. Colonial innovation, sand timers, sundials, water clocks. Now, don't go thinking they had nothing mechanical at all. Some clever folks used sand timers, turning the glass over to mark a set stretch of time. Sundials, too, standing in gardens or nailed to wooden posts, telling the hour when the sun was high. And even them old water clocks, dripping, marking time by the slow fall of drops, made their way into some colonies. They weren't common, mind you, but every so often, a scholar or merchant might have one. Tools like these showed mankind's hunger to master time, even before alarm clocks proper came along. Role of apprentices and servants. Now here's something practical. In many households, the task of waking the family fell to apprentices, servants, or the youngest children. Picture a boy barely 12, shaking his master awake at dawn, or a maid knocking on doors in the dim light of morning. These human alarms weren't optional, they were duty. And if you failed it, there'd be a sharp tongue or worse waiting for you. Families worked like machines, every cog turning the other, and waking folks was part of that machine. Cultural attitudes toward sleep. And I'll tell you something curious. Colonists respected sleep, but they feared too much of it. They knew the body needed rest, but they also whispered that sleep could make a man weak, dull his spirit. Proverbs filled their world. Sloth casteth into a deep sleep, and an idle soul shall suffer hunger. They carried those words heavy in their hearts. So waking early weren't just practical, it was a show of strength, of righteousness. Imagine it. Even in their beds they felt judged, measured, weighed by how quick they met the dawn. Now, as the 1600s rolled toward the 1700s, Europe was cooking up marvels of clockwork. Spring-driven clocks, brass gears, even mechanisms that could be set to chime at a certain hour. Rich folk, merchants, governors, gentlemen with coin, began importing these beauties across the sea. In some fine colonial homes, tucked away in parlors, there stood clocks with delicate faces, hands ticking, and little bells that could wake a man like magic. They were rare, mind you, rare as silver teeth. But they marked the beginning of the age when waking up became less about roosters and more about machines. How these methods shaped daily rhythm. But most folk, well, they still leaned on the old ways. The rooster crowing, the bell tolling, the servant knocking, the sun itself dragging you out of dreams. That's what shaped the rhythm of life. A community tied together by shared sounds and shared duties. It made folks depend on each other. You rose when the village rose, you worked when the bells called, you rested when the sun sank. Time was communal, not personal. The world moved in one rhythm, and if you broke it, you stood out. The legacy today, and now, young'uns, look where we stand. Alarms in our pockets, alarms on our wrists, alarms on our walls. We got more ways to wake than a man can count. And yet, somehow, we're still fighting it, still hitting snooze, still struggling to rise. Maybe there's a lesson in them old ways. Maybe waking shouldn't just be about machines shouting at us, but about honor, about discipline, about hearing the rooster inside ourselves. So next time you curse your alarm, just remember, in them 17th century mornings, waking up weren't just a chore. It was a virtue. It was a duty. And it was, in its own humble way, the start of civilization's march toward time as we know it. So there you have it. From roosters to bells, from servants to spring clocks, the human race has always wrestled with waking on time. And in them colonial days, it shaped more than mornings. It shaped character. And that, my dear listener, is the legacy of the human alarm.